If you're teaching adult English language learners, how do you start each lesson in a way that's interesting, fun, not too challenging, and actually useful? So let's actually start by talking about what not to do. Here's how not to start your lesson. Hello, class. Today we're going to learn about insert boring technical sounding grammar point here. For example, hello, class. Today we're going to learn about the present perfect. So, why not? If you do that, what happens? Well, first of all, if your students have any negative feelings about grammar, then they might immediately think something like, oh no, this is going to be hard, or this is going to be boring, or the present perfect, what now? Or they might even think, okay, I already know this. I've already learned the present perfect, so this lesson is going to be too easy, or this lesson is going to be useless. And I'm guessing that none of that is how you want your students to feel 3 seconds into your lesson. Plus, I think possibly the worst thing about starting your lesson that way, today we're going to learn about the present perfect, is where do you go from there? Probably it naturally leads right into some sort of teacher fronted grammar lecture. Now, one way that we can use the present perfect is to connect the past to the present. So we can use it to describe an action that started in the past and is still true now. That already sounds like a super fun and useful lesson, right? Not so much. Or even if you do try to involve the students directly from this starting point, it ends up going something like this. Okay, everybody, today we're going to learn about the present perfect. And then you're thinking, okay, I need to involve my students here. So you say something like, who can tell me what the present perfect is? So now you've just put your students really on the spot at the very beginning of the lesson with no real context, no real guidance or support, no anything really. And so what happens if nobody answers? What do you do next? Or what happens if somebody answers and they happen to explain it quite well? So then is your lesson just over because they already know? But remember, just because students might know what the present perfect is, doesn't mean that they can use it correctly and confidently. So, just to sum up, starting the lesson by saying, today we're going to learn about blah, 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 is not effective because it's not very interesting. It's pretty dry. It doesn't provide any sort of authentic context or relevant real life situation. It risks making your students feel like the lesson is going to be difficult or boring or confusing or useless. And it often leads right into some kind of teacher fronted lecture or maybe a misguided, way too open ended attempt at getting students involved that doesn't really work. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, I get it, but what if it's not grammar, right? That's grammar. So what if I start the lesson by saying, today we're going to practice reading, or today we're going to learn some new vocabulary, or even today we're going to practice speaking. But the thing is, those same problems still tend to come up. What if you have a student who doesn't like reading, or who is sick of vocabulary, or who tends to be shy when it comes to speaking activities? And again, where do you go after that? Today we're going to practice reading, so here's an article, let's read it. Or today we're going to learn some new vocabulary. And word number one is, or today we're going to practice speaking, so here are 10 discussion questions. In every case, it still feels a little bit abrupt and kind of random, and there's still really no authentic context or anything that makes the lesson feel terribly relevant to things that happen with language in real life outside of the lesson. So that begs the question, how do we start the lesson instead? And the answer is with a lead-in. Okay, so what's a lead-in? At the risk of stating the obvious, a lead-in is how you lead in to the material or the target language or whatever you're planning to cover in your lesson, but in a more gradual, interesting, contextualized way. So it's a way to engage your students in the topic of the lesson and really get them excited and motivated to participate in your class. And ideally, it's also a chance to let your students warm up a little bit and sort of get back into English mode, because depending on where your students are, they may not have really even used English very much since the last lesson. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's a way to set the context of your lessons in which the language or whatever else you're planning on teaching in that lesson is likely to occur. So if you're unsure even of what I mean by context, it's basically just a fancy way of saying the lesson's topic, but a little bit more about that in just a minute. First, here are some general guidelines for any lead-in. So, number one, a lead in should always happen at the beginning of the lesson. This is how you start each lesson. Guideline number two, in a typical 60-minute lesson, a lead in should be about 5 minutes maximum. So, this means that you'll have time for one quick activity, but probably not more than one. And if you're doing this well, you shouldn't need more than one. Guideline number three, if you're looking for an exact, nicely worded aim, if you work in a language school or somewhere where you submit lesson plans, the aim of a lead in is to set the context of the lesson, engage students in the topic, to let the students warm up, and to activate students' background or language knowledge on the topic. So, if it's effective, a lead in can do all of this as easily in 5 minutes as it can in 20. Remember that you're going to want to save time for everything else that's coming, the meat of the lesson that's happening later on. And then finally, guideline number four, a lead in should not focus on specific language like grammar or vocabulary. So, counter to what you might think, right? Well, if I'm teaching the present perfect, shouldn't I tell students that at the beginning of the lesson, or shouldn't I somehow set up the idea of present perfect at the beginning of the lesson? That's not actually necessary. Again, the purpose of a lead in is just to get students engaged in the topic, set the context, and let them warm up. It's not to get into the language yet. All of that can come later on after the lead in. Okay, so now that we have the general guidelines, how do we design or create an actual lead in? Let's go through an example together. So, for our example, let's say that I'm teaching a lesson on the present perfect. And by now, I think I've made my point that starting this lesson by saying, today we're going to learn about the present perfect, is not an effective lead in. So, what do we do instead? Step number one is to keep in mind that if you're teaching the present perfect, obviously your goal as the teacher is for the students by the end of the lesson to be better able to use the present perfect, right? But they don't have to know that, especially not in the first 3 seconds of your lesson. Instead, the goal here is almost to trick them in a kind, fun way, not in a mean way, into being interested in that grammar or even using that grammar before they even really realize what's happening. And so to do that, the first thing you need to figure out is the context. So step one in designing an effective lead-in is really to determine the context of the lesson. And just to be super clear, the present perfect, if that's what you're planning to teach, that is not the context. The present perfect is going to be the target language of your lesson. The context is something different. That's the topic. So, in order to settle on a context, what you need to do is think about real life situations in which your target language, in this case, the present perfect, is likely to come up. So, why do we use the present perfect in everyday life? Well, one way in which we use the present perfect is to talk about general life experiences, right? Okay, so what are some general life experiences that are fun or common to talk about? Maybe traveling, for example. Oh, you're going to Paris. I've always wanted to go, but I've never been. Or maybe to talk about food or restaurants. Have you tried that new Italian place yet? It just opened. I've heard it's really good. Or maybe to talk about series or films. Have you heard about that new Netflix show? Yeah, I have, but I haven't started it yet. Maybe I will tonight. So, obviously, there are a lot of different directions in which I could go with this when it comes to context. All I really need to do now is pick one. Whatever I think will be the most interesting or the most relevant for my particular group of students. Quick side note here, it's important to keep your students and obviously their interests and their backgrounds in mind when you're thinking about setting a context or a topic for your lesson. Obviously, if you're working with students who live in a very small village and you know that most of them don't have the opportunity or the means to travel, or maybe if you're teaching a group of refugees who just had to leave their home countries under not very pleasant circumstances, right? Maybe traveling is not the best context to pick. So use your common sense here. You know your students, interests and backgrounds. So obviously, you're going to keep that in mind as you're deciding on a context that's going to be interesting and relevant and appropriate for them. That said, for the purpose of this example lesson that we're talking through together, I'm going to pick traveling because I know that my students enjoy traveling, have the means to travel, and they're interested in that topic. Now that I have my context, traveling, the only thing really left to do is to introduce this context to my students at the beginning of my lesson in a way that is interesting and student-centered. One great way to do this is by letting the students relate to the lesson, relate to the topic in a personalized way. Remember, the goal here is to make it about the students, not about the lesson. So instead of saying, today we're going to talk about traveling, I'm going to start my lesson by asking a direct question about the topic. Who likes to travel? Raise your hand. Great. Have you traveled a lot? Which countries or cities have you visited? Where did you go for your last vacation? So obviously, this is assuming that my student's English level is at least high enough to have a short, simple conversation. If you are teaching beginners, then that is something else. And if that is your situation, then check the notes below this video for an easy way to get some more information about teaching beginners specifically. But for the purposes of our example lead-in, let's assume that you're teaching at least a pre-intermediate level class. And so for this first set of questions, right? Who likes traveling? Where do you like to travel? Where have you traveled recently? You can now put your students in pairs and let them discuss their travel experiences. Let them answer these questions together just for a couple of minutes. That can be your lead-in. It can be as simple as that. Why does this work? Why is this a far better alternative than our original what not to do example of today we're going to learn about blah, blah, blah? Number one reason why this is much more effective is that it's interesting. I think it's safe to say that most people would prefer to talk about their own trip to London or their classmates' adventures in Thailand rather than auxiliary verbs and past participles, right? The ins and outs of the grammar are going to come up later in your lesson once you've hooked your students with something more fun and interesting first. And remember, this travel topic is not totally random. The examples of the grammar that we are later going to introduce and clarify will be in the same context of traveling in this case. So it's leading in to what you're going to talk about in the lesson, but again, in a way that is much more fun than jumping right in with the technical terminology. Reason number two that this is better is that it's personalized. Never underestimate people's desire, even your students, to talk about themselves. And that's fair, isn't it? Honestly, if I'm a student, why should I pay attention to anything I'm learning in this lesson if I can't see how it relates to my own life, the things I talk about on a daily basis, and my own language needs? Reason number three is that it raises the energy level. So if you don't believe me, just try it and see what happens. I'm willing to bet that if you start your lesson this way with a direct question that immediately gets your students talking, within 60 seconds or so, your students will most likely be swapping stories with their partner, laughing, asking each other follow-up questions. And then by the time they've done that in breakout rooms, when it is time to come back together as a class and actually get further into the main meat of the lesson, your students are already going to be smiling, engaged, energized, and ready to go forward. Reason number four is that it's contextualized. So remember that feeling that we don't want to give our students in the first 3 seconds of the lesson. Oh no, grammar is hard or grammar is boring. By starting the lesson with context instead, we've immediately established a situation in which the grammar is likely to come up, right? We've set the stage for the grammar. And so now when it comes time to actually introduce and learn about the grammar later on, there's a reason for it. There's a real life situation in which the grammar can exist. It's not just this random, detached, right? Today we're learning present perfect kind of terminology in a vacuum. Reason number five is that it creates a need for what you're teaching. So think about it for a second. In our planning process, in deciding on which context to use, we've established that the present perfect often comes up when talking about traveling and travel experiences in life. And now we're starting the lesson by asking our students to talk about traveling. That might cause you to ask, okay, but then won't they need that grammar to have those conversations? And if we haven't taught it yet, won't that create a problem? Well, yes, probably they will need to use the present perfect at least a little bit when talking about their past travel experiences. And so, yeah, there's a really good chance that in that initial leading conversation, you're going to hear your students say things like, yes, I go to London before, right? Okay, that's great. Congratulations. You've just established that what you are about to teach is super relevant. So now it's a very easy transition from the lead in, I go to London, to getting some of those sentences up on the board. I've been to London before, and examining the difference, and from there getting into the rules. And so now your students should be especially motivated to pay attention because it's grammar that they've just realized they need. Reason number 6, starting your lead in this student centered, contextualized way also provides immediate feedback for you. So, by contrast, if I start with the old, today we're going to learn about strategy, what kind of reaction do I get from my students? Usually silence, right? Because I'm not asking them anything, I'm not engaging them or involving them in any way. So I'm essentially just going to get blank stares. And whether they're understanding and interested or not, I have no real way to gauge that. I have no real way to check in and see if my students are following, see if my students are interested. But on the other hand, by letting them talk for a few minutes in pairs, I can monitor. Now, if I'm teaching in a physical classroom, I can actually walk around the room and listen in. If I'm teaching online, I can pop into the different breakout rooms and listen in. And in doing that, I can find out what they know about the topic, how interested they are, if they're making some mistakes already with the grammar that I'm planning to teach, if they're already using some of the grammar that I'm planning to teach, what kind of vocabulary words related to the topic they may or may not know, right? I'm getting tons of valuable information that is going to help me understand my students' needs and my students' starting points as we get further into the lesson. And the final reason that this is super valuable is that it takes the pressure off. If I'm a student, I get to warm up my English in this more comfortable chat scenario with my partner rather than having to go right into speaking in front of the entire class right at the beginning of the lesson. And even for me as the teacher, if I'm feeling a little bit nervous about my lesson or unsure whether the students are going to be into it, if I put them in pairs right away and let them start talking about a topic that is interesting for them, then I get this immediate breather and kind of positive reaction. While the students are happily chatting away, I can take a deep breath and kind of prepare myself for the next stages. And I can look around the room in person, or I can pop into the different breakout rooms online and realize that, wow, we're only a couple minutes into the lesson and my students are already having a great time. So, thank you for watching. I hope this video has revolutionized the way you're going to approach starting your lessons. Let me know in the comments if you found this useful and what in this video was a big aha moment or takeaway for you. And if you're ready, go ahead and watch the next video where I'm going to give you 5 exact lead-in activity ideas that you can use in your own lessons.